The rain fell in relentless sheets, soaking everything in its path. The streets of New York City were slick and shimmering under the pale glow of streetlights. Among the shadows of towering buildings, a man shuffled along, clutching a worn-out coat tightly around himself. His name was Jacob, a once promising architect who had fallen on hard times. Jacob lived in the quiet corners of the city, often unseen by its bustling inhabitants. Tonight, as he searched for a dry spot to rest, his sharp ears caught the faint sound of crying. He stopped, scanning the empty alleyway. "Hello," he called out, his voice rough from the cold and lack of use. The crying stopped abruptly. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Beneath the dim flicker of a streetlight, he saw her, a little girl, no older than 6, her bright pink jacket muddy and torn. She stepped curled up against a dumpster, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Hey there," Jacob said softly, crouching down to her level. "What's your name?" The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face trembling. "I'm Maddie," she whispered. "Where are your parents, Maddie?" She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know. I was with my nanny, but I got lost." Jacob's heart clenched. It wasn't unusual for children to wander off in a city this big. But Maddie looked like she'd been out here for hours. Her small hands were red with cold, and her cheeks were streaked with grime. "Okay, Maddie," Jacob said gently. "I'm going to help you find your family. But first, let's get you somewhere warm." Jacob led Maddie to a nearby diner he knew stayed open late. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and the staff knew him well enough not to ask too many questions. As they entered, the hostess gave Jacob a skeptical glance, but softened when she saw the shivering child by his side. "Everything okay, Jacob?" she asked. "Just need a place to sit for a while," Jacob replied. "I'll keep it quiet." They slid into a booth in the back, and Jacob flagged down a waitress. "Can we get some hot chocolate for her? Put it on my tab." The waitress raised an eyebrow but nodded. As Maddie sipped her drink, Jacob leaned forward. "Do you remember where you were before you got lost? A park? A store?" Maddie sniffled, her small hands clutching the mug. "We were at the big park with the fountain. Nanny said she had to take a call, and I saw a puppy. I followed it, but when I turned around, she was gone." Jacob nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Central Park was massive, and if Maddie had wandered off, finding her nanny would be like finding a needle in a haystack. As they sat, Jacob noticed a television mounted on the wall. The news was playing, and a breaking story caught his attention. Search continues for missing girl in Manhattan. Jacob's breath hitched as a photo of Maddie appeared on the screen. She was smiling brightly in the picture, her hair neatly braided, her pink jacket pristine. Beside her was an older man, distinguished and imposing, her father. Alexander Carrington. Jacob's stomach dropped. He recognized the name instantly. Alexander Carrington was one of the wealthiest men in the country, the head of a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. He turned to Maddie, who was now nibbling on a piece of toast the waitress had brought her. "Maddie, is your dad's name Alexander?" She nodded, her eyes widening. You know him," Jacob exhaled slowly. "Not personally, but a lot of people know who he is." Jacob's first instinct was to march straight to the nearest police station, but he hesitated. He'd had his own run-ins with law enforcement in the past, and he knew how they treated people like him. Homeless, ragged, invisible. Would they even believe him if he walked in with a billionaire's lost daughter? He looked at Maddie, who was now curled up in the booth, fighting to keep her eyes open. For the first time in years, Jacob felt the stirrings of responsibility. He couldn't abandon her, not now. "Come on, kiddo," he said softly, picking up her coat. "Let's get moving. We'll find your dad." As they stepped out into the night, Jacob felt a prickling at the back of his neck. He turned to see a black SUV idling across the street. The windows were tinted, but he could feel eyes on him. Before he could react, the passenger door opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Jacob instinctively pulled Maddie closer. "Who are you?" The man held up a badge. "Private security for the Carrington family. We've been searching for her all night." Maddie's eyes lit up. "You work for Daddy?" The man nodded, his demeanor softening slightly. "That's right, Miss Maddie. Your father's been very worried about you." Jacob hesitated. There was something unsettling about the man's presence, but before he could decide, Maddie reached for the security guard, clearly recognizing him. "It's okay," she said to Jacob. "He's nice." Reluctantly, Jacob released her hand. The man scooped Maddie up and carried her to the SUV, where another guard opened the door. Just as Jacob turned to leave, the man stopped him. "Wait." Jacob froze. The guard looked him over, his gaze lingering on Jacob's tattered coat and worn shoes. "Mr. Carrington will want to thank you personally. You're coming with us." Jacob's eyes widened. "That's not necessary. It wasn't a request," the man interrupted. Jacob found himself in the back of the SUV, Maddie fast asleep beside him. The city lights blurred past as they drove uptown, the streets growing quieter and more opulent. When they pulled up to the Carrington estate, Jacob's breath caught. The mansion was enormous, its grand facade glowing under the floodlights. Security guards lined the driveway, and the front doors opened as they approached. Standing in the entryway was Alexander Carrington himself. His face was lined with worry, but his eyes lit up as Maddie ran to him. "Daddy!" she cried, throwing her arms around his neck. Alexander held her tightly, his expression softening. Then his gaze shifted to Jacob and his features hardened. "You found her," Alexander said, his tone unreadable. Jacob nodded. "She was lost in an alley. I just wanted to help." Alexander studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Come inside. We need to talk." The first chapter ends here, with Jacob stepping into a world far removed from his own, unsure if his act of kindness will be rewarded, or if it will lead to more trouble than he ever anticipated. Jacob hesitated at the threshold of the Grand Carrington estate. The opulence before him felt surreal. Gleaming marble floors, cowering ceilings, and walls adorned with priceless artwork. For a moment, he considered turning and walking away. This wasn't his world, and the thought of being scrutinized by someone as powerful as Alexander Carrington made his stomach churn. His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for refusal. Reluctantly, Jacob stepped over the threshold, his wet shoes squeaking against the polished floors. The warmth of the house enveloped him, a stark contrast to the cold streets he had just left behind. Maddie, now cradled in her father's arms, had fallen asleep, her head resting on his shoulder. "Follow me," Alexander said. They walked through the grand hall to a cozy study with a roaring fireplace. Alexander carefully laid Maddie on a nearby couch, draping a soft blanket over her. Then he turned to Jacob, his piercing blue eyes sharp and unyielding. "Sit," he said, motioning to a leather chair. Jacob perched on the edge of the chair, his posture uneasy. Alexander stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "I owe you my daughter's life," Alexander began. "But I need to know the details. How did you find her?" Jacob recounted the evening, hearing Maddie's cries in the alley, taking her to the diner, and recognizing her from the news. He spoke plainly, leaving nothing out. Alexander listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Jacob finished, there was a long silence. "You've done something remarkable," Alexander said finally, "but I have to ask, why? What were you hoping to gain?" The question stung, though Jacob had expected it. "I wasn't hoping to gain anything," he replied, meeting Alexander's gaze. "She's a child. She was scared and alone. I just did what anyone should do." Alexander studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to discern the truth. Finally, he nodded. "Most people wouldn't have bothered," Alexander said, "especially not someone in your position." Jacob stiffened. "And what position is that?" Alexander gestured to Jacob's tattered coat and worn boots. "Let's not pretend, mister." "Jacob," he said curtly. "Jacob," he said curtly. "Let's not pretend that society hasn't made people like you invisible. Yet here you are." Jacob felt his face flush, a mix of embarrassment and anger rising in his chest. "Look, I didn't come here to be judged. If you're done thanking me, I'll leave." He stood, but Alexander held up a hand. "Wait. I didn't mean to offend you. Sit down." Jacob hesitated before lowering himself back into the chair. Alexander walked to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a checkbook. He sat and began writing. "This is for your trouble," Alexander said, tearing the check free and holding it out to Jacob. Jacob glanced at it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the number. $50,000. He swallowed hard. That money could change his life, get him off the streets, help him rebuild. But something in him balked. Taking the check felt wrong, like it cheapened what he'd done for Maddie. "I don't want your money," Jacob said, his voice steady. Alexander's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Why not? You've earned it." "I didn't help Maddie for a reward," Jacob said. "I helped her because it was the right thing to do." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying Jacob with newfound respect. He set the check on the desk but didn't push it further. "Fair enough," he said. "But I'm not letting you walk out of here empty-handed. Is there anything you need? A job, perhaps?" Jacob blinked, caught off guard. "A job?" "Yes," Alexander said. "You're clearly resourceful and trustworthy. Those are qualities I value. Come, work for me." The next day, Jacob found himself in a suit that didn't quite feel like his own, standing in the sleek offices of Carrington Enterprises. He had accepted Alexander's offer, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. He started as an assistant in the logistics department, organizing shipments and managing schedules. The work was straightforward but demanding, and Jacob threw himself into it. Meanwhile, word of Maddie's rescue had spread through the company, and whispers about Jacob's background followed him wherever he went. Some employees treated him kindly, while others regarded him with suspicion or disdain. "Must be nice to have the boss favor." Jacob ignored the comments, focusing on proving himself. One evening, as Jacob was leaving work, a woman approached him in the lobby. She was elegantly dressed, her sharp eyes betraying a keen intelligence. "You're Jacob, right?" she asked. He nodded cautiously. "Who's asking?" "I'm Grace," she said. I work in corporate investigations for Carrington Enterprises. I wanted to thank you for what you did for Maddie. Jacob nodded. Just doing the right thing. Grace smiled faintly. I've been with the company for years, and I've never seen Mr. Carrington take to someone the way he's taken to you. But I need to warn you, this world isn't as simple as it seems. Jacob frowned. What are you talking about? Grace leaned in slightly. There's a reason Maddie was lost that night, and it wasn't an accident. Jacob's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Grace hesitated before continuing. I can't say much here, but Maddie's disappearance wasn't random. Someone in the company, someone close, wanted her out of the picture. You walking into her life wasn't just luck. It might have saved her from something much worse. Jacob stared at her, his mind racing. Why are you telling me this? Because you're part of this now, Grace said. And if you're not careful, they'll come for you too. Jacob lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling as Grace's words echoed in his mind. Maddie's disappearance wasn't random. Someone wanted her out of the picture. The idea gnawed at him. Who could want harm to come to a child, especially one as innocent as Maddie? And why would anyone within Carrington Enterprises, a company built on Alexander's iron reputation, risk such a dangerous play? As the hours ticked by, Jacob's resolve hardened. He had stumbled into something much larger than himself, but he couldn't just turn a blind eye. Maddie's safety depended on finding the truth, and if Grace was right, his own life might be at risk as well. The next morning, Jacob arrived at work to find his desk unusually clean. Papers he'd left the night before had been neatly stacked, and the drawer where he kept his personal notes had been left ajar. Frowning, he sat down and opened the drawer. A single folded piece of paper lay inside. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Jacob's heart raced. He glanced around the office, but his co-workers were busy typing, chatting, or sipping their morning coffee. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Everything okay? A voice asked. Jacob turned to see Grace standing nearby, her sharp eyes watching him carefully. He hesitated before handing her the note. Her expression darkened as she read it. It's starting, she muttered. What's starting? Jacob asked. Grace leaned closer, lowering her voice. The people behind Maddie's disappearance don't take kindly to outsiders meddling in their plans. This note is a warning, but it's just the beginning. Jacob clenched his fists. I'm not backing down. Grace gave him a faint smile. Good, because neither am I. Over the next few days, Jacob and Grace began piecing together what they could about the night Maddie went missing. Grace, with her access to company records, discovered a series of financial transactions that pointed to something suspicious. Unauthorized withdrawals from the company's accounts, payments made to a private security firm under the radar, connections to individuals with criminal records. But the most damning piece of evidence came from an encrypted email thread Grace managed to recover. The emails, sent between high-level executives, discussed removing distractions to protect the company's future. One name stood out in the thread: Henry Graves, Carrington Enterprises' Chief Operating Officer. Henry Graves was a polished man in his early 50s, with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. As Alexander's right-hand man, he was trusted with the company's most critical decisions. But Grace's findings suggested he might be playing a double game. He's the one pulling the strings, Grace said, showing Jacob the emails. He has the power, the connections, and the motive. Jacob frowned. Motive for what? What does Maddie have to do with any of this? Grace hesitated. I think Maddie's just a pawn. Graves might see her as a liability, something that could distract Alexander or weaken his position. If Graves wants control of the company, eliminating Maddie would shift Alexander's focus and make him vulnerable. Jacob's snubber churned. You think he was planning to hurt her? I think he already tried, Grace replied. That evening, grimly, Jacob made a bold decision. He would confront Henry Graves directly. Graves tried to dissuade him, warning that it was too risky, but Jacob's mind was made up. He couldn't sit back and let a man like Graves continue operating in the shadows. He waited until most of the office had cleared out, then approached Graves's private office. The door was slightly ajar, and voices drifted into the hallway. Already taken care of, Graves was saying. The boy doesn't know anything useful. Let him flounder. Jacob's blood ran cold. He pushed the door open, startling Graves and the man he was speaking to, a burly figure in a black suit. Ah, Jacob, Graves said smoothly, recovering quickly. What can I do for you? Jacob stepped inside, his fists clenched. I know what you've been doing, Graves. Maddie's disappearance, the financial cover-ups, it all points back to you. Graves smirked, leaning back in his chair. That's quite the accusation. Do you have proof? I don't need proof to know what kind of man you are, Jacob shot back, but I will get it. And when I do, I'll make sure you pay for what you've done. Graves' smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. You're playing a dangerous game, Jacob. You have no idea who you're up against. Jacob took a step closer. I know enough, and I won't stop until the truth comes out. Graves gestured to the burly man beside him. Show Mr. Jacob the way out. The man grabbed Jacob's arm, but Jacob yanked it free. I'm leaving, he said, his voice steady, but this isn't over. The confrontation left Jacob rattled, but it also solidified his resolve. When he told Grace what had happened, she was furious. You shouldn't have gone alone, she scolded. Graves won't let this slide. I don't care, Jacob said. We're close to the truth. We can't stop now. Grace sighed. You're lucky. Graves may be powerful, but he's not untouchable. We just need to find the right leverage. That leverage came in the form of an unlikely ally, Alexander Carrington himself. Jacob and Grace decided to bring their findings to Alexander. It was a risk. If he didn't believe them, their efforts would be for nothing, but they had no other choice. When they arrived at the Carrington estate, Alexander greeted them with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. This better be important, he said, ushering them into his study. It is, Jacob said, laying the evidence on the desk. Your COO, Henry Graves, has been orchestrating a scheme against you. Maddie's disappearance was just part of his plan. Alexander's face darkened as he read through the documents. His hands trembled slightly as he pieced together the betrayal. I trusted him, Alexander said quietly. He's been with me for years. And he's been using that trust against you, Grace added. We have enough to expose him, but we need your backing. Alexander looked up, his expression hardening. You have it. Graves won't get away with this. The Carrington estate buzzed with activity as Alexander, Jacob, and Grace prepared their next move. Alexander had spent the night poring over the evidence, the weight of Henry Graves's betrayal etched into his stern expression. This ends today, Alexander said, his voice low but firm. Graves has been poisoning this company and my family for too long. I won't let him get away with it. Jacob nodded and rose as well, but Graves has been poisoning his company and my family for too long. I won't let him get away with it. He hadn't set out to be a hero, but he couldn't turn back now. What's the plan? Alexander leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Jacob and Grace. We're going to confront Graves at the board meeting this afternoon. With the evidence you've gathered, we'll make sure he's held accountable. But we need to be careful. If he feels cornered, he might do something desperate. Grace smirked. Let's make sure he doesn't get the chance. The boardroom of Carrington Enterprises was an imposing space with a long mahogany table and walls lined with portraits of past leaders. Today, the room was filled with tension as the company's board members shuffled in, murmuring amongst themselves. At the head of the table sat Henry Graves, his expression calm and composed. He greeted each board member with a firm handshake, radiating confidence. When Alexander entered the room, flanked by Jacob and Grace, the murmurs quieted. Graves's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Alexander," he said smoothly, "what a pleasant surprise. I wasn't expecting you at today's meeting." Alexander's voice was icy. "Cut the act, Henry. We know what you've been doing." Graves' expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Jacob stepped forward, holding up a folder of documents. "This says otherwise." Grace activated a projector, displaying incriminating emails, financial records, and the security contracts Graves had signed without authorization. The board members leaned forward, their faces a mix of shock and outrage. "This is absurd," Graves said, his voice rising. "You can't seriously believe I had anything to do with this?" "Maddie's disappearance wasn't a coincidence," Jacob said, his voice steady. "You orchestrated it to destabilize Alexander and take control of the company." Graves shot to his feet, slamming his hands on the table. "That's a lie. Sit down, Henry," Alexander said coldly. "You're done." Graves hesitated, his eyes darting between Alexander and the board members. He was cornered and he knew it, but instead of backing down, he straightened and smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "You think you've won?" Graves said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You have no idea how deep this goes. Taking me down won't stop what's coming." "A promise." Alexander stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Is that a threat?" Graves chuckled. "It's a reality. You think you've uncovered the truth, but this company is built on secrets. Taking me out won't change that." Before anyone could respond, Graves reached into his briefcase, pulling out a folder. He tossed it onto the table. "Go ahead," he said, "expose me. But when the dust settles, you'll realize I was the least of your problems." Moments later, the door to the boardroom burst open and a team of FBI agents stormed in, led by Agent Robert Lane. "Henry Graves," Lane announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, and endangerment of a minor." Graves glared at Alexander. "This isn't over." "It is for you," Alexander said, his tone unwavering. As the agents cuffed Graves and led him out of the room, the board erupted in conversation. Alexander raised a hand, silencing them. "This company has been compromised, but today marks the beginning of its recovery," he said. "We will rebuild with integrity." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the Graves scandal sent shockwaves through Carrington Enterprises. Alexander worked tirelessly to repair the company's reputation, with Grace by his side as head of corporate investigations. Jacob, meanwhile, found himself in a new role, Director of Community Outreach. Under Alexander's guidance, Jacob spearheaded initiatives to help homeless individuals reintegrate into society, using his own story as inspiration. One afternoon, as Jacob was preparing for a meeting, Maddie ran into his office, her face beaming. "Uncle Jacob," she cried, throwing her arms around him. Jacob laughed, lifting her into the air. "Hey, kiddo, what's up?" "Daddy says we're going to the park," Maddie said. "You have to come." Jacob glanced at Alexander, who stood in the doorway, smiling. "You've earned a break," Alexander said. Jacob set Maddie down and nodded. "Let's go." As the sun set over the city, Jacob sat on a park bench, watching Maddie play with other children. Alexander joined him, handing him a coffee. "You've come a long way," Alexander said. Jacob nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "I couldn't have done it without Maddie. She reminded me that doing the right thing matters." Alexander chuckled. "She has that effect on people." The two men sat in comfortable silence, the chaos of the past few months finally giving way to peace. Jacob knew his journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future. And as Maddie's laughter filled the air, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could spark the greatest changes.